So we're here today with Dr. Ethan Bernstein, who is Assistant Professor of Leadership and Organizational Behavior at the Harvard Business School. He's also the Academy of Management's 2015 Outstanding Practitioner-oriented Publication in Organizational Behavior Award for the paper The Transparency Trap. And we're here today to talk about this paper and to learn and get some insights from you about the research behind it. First of all, congratulations on your award.
Thank you, Patricia. It's great to be here with you.
Thank you for being here with us. In your paper, you argue that work environments that are open and transparent are not always beneficial. Too much transparency is counterproductive. Why is that the case? Why is transparency a trap?
So the idea behind the transparency trap is that, like most things in life, too much is not a good thing. So we've been trying very hard for a long time to add transparency to organizations because we probably had too little of it. We've had too much slack. We've had potentially bad actors that we wanted to be able to view. We wanted to be able to help people learn and respond to one another and collaborate. But then again, on the other hand, we do need to start thinking about this idea of a transparency trap where the fact that you're watched, that you're observed, changes your behavior such that you only do what's expected of you. You're truly living in a compliance world. And in a world increasingly where we want individuals to be innovative and try new things, experiment, maybe even do something that looks weird, that would catch your notice if you were watching, that you might just want them to try to do that just in case there'd be a breakthrough as a result, that we wouldn't catch because they wouldn't try if you were observing them and it was transparent all the time.
I know you observed and studied this phenomenon in more than one organization, but particularly you studied in a mobile phone factory, and there's another paper that you published about this topic. Can you give us a summary of the research that you conducted at that organization?
I'd be thrilled to. I enjoyed that mobile phone study greatly. It started with an idea towards just understanding how transparency, completely transparent factory floors, was enabling productivity. And in order to study that, I did something admittedly that was not very transparent. I took some researchers and embedded them on the line secretly so they could understand how people learned better because they were on a transparent floor. And in fact, they did learn a lot, but they learned two things almost immediately. One, how to do things when someone was watching. And two, how to do things when someone wasn't watching. And two was more productive than one, primarily because in the workers' own words, in order to do things differently in front of someone, they were afraid they would attract their attention, and therefore they wouldn't meet their expectations. They would have to explain why they were doing things differently. It was just so much easier to use the transparency to know when someone was watching, and therefore do less productive things when they were being watched, the standard way of doing things. And once they weren't being watched, then take that freedom to do things in their more productive fashion. So that was the initial finding in that study. We wanted to take it one step further, and so ultimately we conducted a field experiment with 4 out of 32 lines where we put literally like hospital bed curtains, literal curtains, around 4 of the lines. And those lines, on a simple assembly task, were able to increase productivity by 10 or 15%, even while controlling for Hawthorne effects. Because they didn't have to play this game anymore. They could experiment, they could learn, they could try things, and they were accountable for their work. And there was enough pressure within the group, because this wasn't an individual in the curtain, it was a group, enough pressure to ensure they didn't slack off, but not so much transparency that they felt like they were always on stage and couldn't try new things in the process of doing their work.
This was a factory, but I know that you studied the same phenomenon in very different work environments. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, so from there, for example, when I talk about zones of privacy in the transparency trap, I also compare ironically a mobile phone factory in China with a very, very successful game company named Valve Software. And Valve is interesting to me because they allow their workers to completely self-allocate their time to groups. They call them cabals. And these cabals then come together because their desks are on wheels, to do their work. And what was interesting to me wasn't necessarily, although it's very interesting that they organize this way, not just the fact that they organize this way, but when cabals find space, they typically find natural partitions within Valve's offices to form, so that you won't find cabals sort of like all spread out in an open space. You'll actually find them camping out together in closed spaces. I think because they're most comfortable doing their best work that way.
Wow. It's fascinating that in so many different environments you find the same effect. Do you think there are boundary conditions, so an environment where transparency and privacy are more or less important?
Oh, absolutely. There are, this is all going to be, if you would, it's a contingency theory of transparency and privacy. So no two contexts are going to be the same. And we can imagine places where we'd actually rather have compliance, and that's what we'll get for having more and more and more transparency. We've gone from you get what you ask for to you get what you measure to ultimately now you get what you see. So it's going to be a decision by management and by organizations and by the people within them of all levels, shapes, and forms, how much they want to be a compliance-oriented organization and how much they want to be an innovation-oriented organization. And to some extent, the degree of transparency they design into the organization is going to help them determine that. But it doesn't just have to be, and I want to make this clear, it doesn't just have to be zones of privacy. I also talk about several other kinds of zones. Shall I talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And in fact, I was saying that you mentioned in the paper many organizations, or at least some organizations that have found the right balance between transparency and privacy. Can you give us some examples of what organizations can do to avoid the transparency trap?
Yes, perfect. I'd be thrilled to. So aside from these zones of privacy, there's also an attempt by several organizations to separate feedback and evaluation. Because if you think about what I was saying about compliance, we care about compliance much more when we think we're being evaluated, much less when we think that the people who are observing us are just giving us feedback. And that insight comes in part from one of the perfect places to study this, because people are so used to it being their own domain, freedom, private, truck cabs. When a trucker's on the road, he or she is supposed to be completely free.
Yes.
And I think that's why they do it, some of them at least. And yet now, these truckers who are part of trucking companies are finding that the truck companies want to put dash cams, video cameras, into the cab. And this has been a huge issue of, you're putting Big Brother into my freedom. It's been an issue and been very unsuccessful in some organizations, but with colleagues, I looked at one where they've been successful, and the way they were successful, these dash cams don't record all the time. They only record when there's a so-called G-force event. So you run over something particularly deep, or you hit the brakes too quickly, or whatever it might be. And then it records. In this case, that recording goes to a central facility where they screen it to see if it's a coachable event, or if it was just either a malfunction of the camera or something that couldn't have been avoided. If it's a coachable event, and you weren't breaking the law or doing something truly seriously bad, then it goes to a coach who has a feedback conversation with the trucker, and it goes no further than that. Trucker can ignore it, cannot ignore it, but the boss is never involved. It never gets put on a performance evaluation. It's purely for the sake of feedback, and that helps them go from a world in which the truckers hated this idea to now they actually, many of them embrace it. So that's that boundary between judgment and feedback that I think is very helpful.
Yeah.
Another boundary is between improvement rights and decision rights. So we're used to hearing about decision rights and making sure that accountabilities and decision rights are properly allocated within an organization and very transparently done. But improvement rights, these things that we might be able to tweak, like the workers on the mobile phone factory were tweaking, or like we might tweak in our daily work, sitting at a computer, move things around on a desk, whatever it might be, those improvement rights become really important in a world of higher transparency, because if you're not explicit about them, the decision rights eat them up. And so looking at, for example, moonshine shops, or Google's 20% rule, or we looked at a case where a retail company put in a scheduling tool and allowed the store managers and the individuals to edit the algorithmically created schedules so that people felt like they could do these tweaks, these small edits to their work to try and improve it, even though it was a transparent environment, and creating that opportunity, that freedom made the difference.
Well, thank you so much. This is a really fascinating research, and I'm sure that it will be impactful for many, many organizations and will help organizations to design their work environment more effectively. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us.
Thank you for inviting me to do so.
We are so appreciative of having you here, and congratulations again on your award.
Thank you very much.